People in Stanstead in Quebec and Darby Line in Vermont have spent generations living in a town where a few steps can move them from one country to another. The border runs quietly through streets and gardens. Some homes stand so close to the line that a kitchen sits in Canada and a living room sits in the United States. The public library that anchors the neighborhood is world famous because its front door faces Vermont, while its reading rooms and performance halls sit in Quebec. For people who grew up here, this is not a curiosity, but a normal way of life built on shared trust and an unwritten understanding between two countries. The Haskell Free Library and Opera House was built more than a century ago by a family with ties on both sides of the line. They designed it so that it would straddle the boundary and serve as a gift to both nations. Inside, a dark stripe on the floor shows exactly where the border runs. For decades, children crossed it to attend bilingual story hours. Choirs rehearsed on the stage while audience members sat across two countries. Couples married in a building that stood equally in both nations. The structure became a symbol of how communities can treat a border as a meeting place rather than a dividing wall. In recent years, officials in the United States have moved to change the way people enter the building. By October 2025, new rules were scheduled to take effect, and by late 2025 and into 2026, those rules were continuing to shape how Canadians approach the library. Under these rules, Canadians who for generations had entered through the front door on the Vermont side were required either to come through the Canadian entrance or to pass through an official port of entry before stepping inside from the U.S. sidewalk. Card-holding patrons and staff were given a temporary allowance, but ordinary visitors were directed to the Canadian side. Officials framed the change as part of a broader security program at the northern boundary. Residents on both sides of the line say the change has altered daily life. For more than 100 years, the front door on the Vermont side had been an informal link between two countries. Parents sent children across the street after school without paperwork. Visitors came for concerts or to borrow books without thinking about passports. Now people must plan ahead, show identification, and sometimes walk further to reach the entrance. Library staff have had to redirect foot traffic and post signs explaining which door to use. People who relied on the old routine speak of sadness and inconvenience, but also of determination to adapt. Officials in Washington point to concerns about smuggling and unauthorized entry. They have cited dozens of apprehensions and several vehicle seizures near the area in recent years as evidence that the building's unique position could be misused. Supporters of the change argue that national security must be consistent even at symbolic locations. Critics respond that the evidence is thin and that a century of cooperation should carry more weight than isolated incidents. They see the shift as a case of imposing a big system on a small community. The library board and volunteers in Stanstead have launched a major project to upgrade the Canadian entrance. The old door was never designed for heavy public use and lacks accessible parking. The ground slopes steeply and winter ice makes the approach hazardous. Engineers have drawn up plans for a new walkway that complies with modern safety and accessibility standards. The total cost is expected to reach well into 6 figures in Canadian dollars. Fundraisers on both sides of the border have contributed tens of thousands so far. Local contractors have offered advice so that historic details will be preserved even as the entrance is rebuilt. Businesses in the Twin Towns are feeling the change. For decades, small shops and gas stations on the Vermont side relied on Canadian visitors who crossed easily for lunch, fuel, or shopping. Concerts at the Opera House often drew audiences from both countries who spent money in nearby restaurants. Now some of that foot traffic has dropped. Owners report slower weekends and fewer familiar faces. The impact is gradual but unmistakable. In small towns, a handful of missing customers can mean the difference between survival and closure. The cross-border economy that sustained the area depends on movement as fluid as the community's identity. That identity is rooted in history. Long before surveyors drew precise lines, families settled across the region as if it were one area. The Haskell family built the library and opera house to acknowledge that reality. Over the years, the building hosted readings, concerts, weddings, and even funerals. Children grew up seeing a border not as a barrier, but as a curiosity. Today, many elders fear that feeling is slipping away. Cameras on poles and concrete blocks near sidewalks remind them that global security debates now reach their quiet town. Officials in both countries say they are trying to balance safety and community life. They note that exceptions remain for emergency responders, mail carriers, and people with disabilities, so essential services continue without interruption. They emphasize that the library is still open and that Canadians still have access through the Canadian side. Yet to residents who remember walking in freely, those assurances feel narrow. The front door was more than a physical entry. It was a symbol of mutual trust. Legal experts describe the Haskell as a special case at the edge of two systems. It exists under the domestic law of both nations, yet no formal treaty governs its use. For a century, customs and immigration rules were not applied within its walls because both governments trusted the community. When officials impose inspections, they must navigate overlapping rules on heritage, public access, and bilateral cooperation. Scholars warn that a strict approach here could undermine other shared services, such as water systems, emergency response, and road maintenance, which depend on similar cross-border goodwill. The Haskell Library is not alone. Beebe Plain nearby has a street where the border runs down the center of the pavement. Piney Pine Creek Airport once allowed planes to land on a runway crossing from Minnesota into Manitoba. Small crossings along Maine and New Brunswick have seen reduced hours and tighter inspections. All of these communities illustrate the same pattern. Settlers arrived first, boundaries came later, and now governments are retrofitting security onto places built for openness. Safety concerns about migration and trafficking have also touched the region. In late summer, Canadian authorities announced arrests connected to a smuggling operation near the border. Local broadcasters reported dozens of people taken into custody. Such incidents do not define the character of Stanstead and Darby Line, yet they influence how national agencies view the corridor. Residents who want to preserve openness must now make their case against a backdrop of national and international security pressures. Culture persists even as rules change. The Opera House still hosts music and theater with audiences from both sides, though more arrive through the Canadian door. Reading rooms still fill with children holding bilingual books. Volunteers still plan festivals in local markets that welcome neighbors regardless of nationality. Teachers still bring classes to learn about the geography of a building that crosses an international boundary. On quiet afternoons, the library feels like it always has. Sunlight falling through tall windows onto shelves lined with books from both cultures. Economists who study small towns say adaptation is vital. A difference of a few dozen customers or a single marquee event can tip the balance of a local economy. When rules add friction, some customers drift away. If friction lasts too long, the loss compounds. Yet when communities turn change into a story, they can attract support from outside. Residents here have begun doing exactly that, reaching out to arts foundations and binational civic groups and lobbying their elected officials for help. They have made the Haskell Library a cause rather than a casualty. Politics swirl in the background. National leaders debate how to manage fentanyl trafficking and irregular migration. They weigh budgets for surveillance technology and personnel. They consider revising long-standing practices, such as flag polling, where people leave and re-enter briefly to complete immigration paperwork. These debates may seem far from a room of books and children, but their outcomes shape the doors and sidewalks of the library. Each new rule brings an adjustment, and each adjustment reshapes how a community feels. Yet there is resilience here. When rules changed, residents did not only complain, they organized meetings, posted accurate information, and invited officials to see their situation firsthand. They raised funds for accessibility upgrades and ensured that bilingual programs continued. They kept schedules full and lights on in the performance hall. They proved that even when a doorway narrows, a library can still act as a bridge. Journalists who cover the region describe the Haskell not only as a symbol, but as a living institution. Staff members catalog new titles and plan programs. Volunteers repair costumes and prepare stage sets. Technicians check sound systems for weekend concerts. Children choose picture books and sit at tables under old plasterwork that has seen a century of events. The black stripe on the floor is a curiosity, but it fades from attention when people are busy with ordinary life. That ordinariness is what residents want to protect. They accept that rules exist, but ask that those rules be applied with an understanding of place. Beyond the library, the Twin Towns remain a case study in how borders can be managed as shared spaces rather than fortified edges. Law enforcement agencies on both sides coordinate on emergencies. Fire crews cross over when needed. Families navigate paperwork so they can attend school events or medical appointments across the line. Businesses buy supplies from whichever side offers the best price. Seasonal traditions move back and forth because winter festivals and summer markets depend on everyone showing up. Cooperation here is not an abstraction, but a habit formed through thousands of practical acts. The coming years will show whether national agencies can treat those habits as assets rather than vulnerabilities. Security officials will continue to stress consistency and risk management. Residents will continue to ask for a tailored approach that respects heritage and everyday reality. Elected representatives in Quebec and Vermont will keep arguing that friendship at the border has value that cannot be measured only by arrest counts or inspection times. The story of the Haskell will remain in policy debates because it gives a human face to questions that otherwise remain theoretical. For people who have never visited the building, it may seem like a minor inconvenience. Yet small-town Canada and small-town America have long acted as glue in a relationship that spans trade, defense, and culture. A loss of ease in places like Stanstead and Darby Line signals a shift in that relationship. Conversely, a constructive compromise here could model how to secure a boundary without stripping it of character. That is why reporters keep returning to this corner of the map. The story is small in scale, but large in meaning. On an ordinary weekday morning, the sidewalk is quiet. The front door on the Vermont side opens to American air, and the reading rooms beyond sit squarely in Canada. A librarian wheels a cart of new books past the stripe on the floor. A parent guides a child to a table where sunlight falls through tall windows. The scene looks ordinary because it is ordinary, and that ordinariness is the point. It emerged from a century of trust and shared effort. The town exists in both the United States and Canada because people decided to live that way and then proved that it could work. As new rules unfold into 2026, the question becomes how to carry that decision forward under regulations that feel different from the past. The answer will be written in the patience of neighbors and in the pages turned in a library that bridges two nations.